The prairie wind howled like a lonely wolf, cutting through the log walls of the small homestead where young Thomas lay awake, listening. Winter had come early that year, and the cold seeped into every crack of the cabin, no matter how tightly his father had stuffed the gaps with mud and straw. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only embers glowing faintly in the dark. His parents and younger sister slept soundly, bundled under thick quilts, but Thomas could not rest. Something had tugged at his thoughts all evening, a feeling like the prickle of unseen eyes watching from the trees. Pulling his thin coat over his nightshirt, he crept to the window, rubbing a clear spot in the frost that coated the glass. The moon hung high, casting silver light over the snow-covered fields. That was when he saw it, a dark shape near the barn, barely moving. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he squinted, the shape took form. A person, curled tight against the cold. His breath fogged the glass as he pressed closer. It was a girl, her long hair tangled with snow, her arms wrapped around herself as she shivered. She wore strange clothing, fringed and beaded, unlike any settler's garb, and her face was pale with sickness. Thomas knew who she must be. The Comanche had been seen near the creek days before, and his father had warned him to stay close to home. Fear whispered in his chest, but another feeling rose, stronger: pity. No one, not even an enemy, should be left to freeze. He hesitated only a moment before slipping on his boots and easing the door open, careful not to let the hinges creak. The cold hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, the snow crunching underfoot. The girl did not stir as he approached. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and her lips were tinged blue. Thomas knelt beside her, unsure what to do. He spoke softly, but she did not understand his words. Her dark eyes flickered open, filled with pain and something else, dignity, even now. Without thinking, he untied the wool blanket from around his own shoulders, the one his mother had woven for him last winter, and draped it over the girl. She flinched at first, as if expecting harm, but then clutched the fabric tightly, pulling it around her like a shield. A noise from the barn made Thomas jump. His father's old mule shifted in its stall, ears twitching. If the animal's stirring woke his parents, there would be trouble. He had to get back inside. But as he turned to leave, the girl's hand darted out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. She said something in her own language, low and urgent. Though he did not understand the words, the meaning was clear. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, then hurried back to the cabin, his heart pounding. By morning, the girl was gone. Only footprints in the snow and the folded blanket now dusted with frost marked where she had been. His father's face darkened when Thomas confessed what he had done. "You don't know what those people are capable of," he muttered, staring toward the tree line. But Thomas could not regret it. Somewhere out there, a girl had been cold, and he had helped. That was all that mattered. Little did he know, his small act of kindness would soon ripple across the prairie, stirring the winds of change and bringing 700 warriors to his doorstep. Dawn broke in silence, the kind of heavy quiet that presses against the ears like a weight. Thomas stood at the edge of the cornfield, his breath fogging in the crisp air as he scanned the tree line where the girl had disappeared. The blanket was gone with her, leaving only trampled snow and the faintest indentation where her body had lain. He should have been relieved, but an odd tightness coiled in his chest, something between worry and anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. His father's voice shattered the stillness, sharp as a whip crack. "Thomas, get inside now." The boy turned to see his father framed in the cabin doorway, rifle in hand, his face ashen. Beyond him, Thomas's mother clutched his little sister close, her eyes wide with a fear he'd never seen before. Then he heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, like distant thunder, but too steady, too deliberate. Hoofbeats. Not the scattered patter of a hunting party, but the rolling thunder of countless horses moving as one. The first warrior emerged from the mist like a shadow given form, tall, mounted on a painted stallion, his face impassive beneath the stark lines of war paint. Then another appeared beside him, and another, until the entire eastern horizon seemed to shift and breathe with the movement of men and horses. They did not charge. They did not whoop or brandish weapons as the settlers' stories had warned. They simply came, a slow, inexorable tide halting just beyond rifle range, their silence more unnerving than any battle cry. Thomas's father grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the cabin. "Comanche," he hissed, as if the word itself were a curse. The door slammed behind them, the bar dropping into place with a finality that made Thomas's stomach lurch. Through the window, he watched the warriors fan out in a vast semicircle, their formation precise, their eyes fixed on the homestead. A man taller than the others rode forward, his headdress trailing feathers that whispered in the wind. Chief Stormhawk. Thomas knew it without being told. The chief's gaze swept over the cabin, the barn, the trembling livestock, then settled, unerringly, on the very window where Thomas stood. His father's hands shook as he passed out muskets. "They'll burn us out by nightfall," he muttered, though the warriors carried no torches. His mother began to pray under her breath, her fingers knotting in her apron. Thomas wanted to speak, to say that these weren't the faceless raiders from the stories, that one of them had been a dying girl, and he'd helped her, but the words withered in his throat. The settlers had built their lives on fear of this moment, and now that it was here, reason held no power. Outside, a single rider broke from the ranks, a young warrior Thomas recognized at once. Running Fox, the boy from his secret meetings at the creek. He rode straight toward the cabin, something clutched in his hand. Thomas's father cocked the rifle, but Thomas lunged forward.
"No."
The gunshot drowned his voice. Running Fox's horse reared, but the boy held fast, his arm snapping up to reveal not a weapon, but a blanket, Thomas's blanket, washed clean and folded with care. The echo of the shot faded into a silence, so absolute, Thomas could hear the rasp of his own breath. Every warrior's hand had gone to their bow or lance, but Chief Stormhawk raised a fist, and like a single creature, they stilled. The chief's voice, when it came, carried across the frozen field like a blade cutting cloth. "You shot at a peace-bearer." The words were in heavily accented English, meant to be understood. "But my daughter's spirit whispers to wait. So we wait." He dismounted, planted his spear in the earth, and sat cross-legged before it, his warriors following suit until the entire army sat motionless on the snow-dusted grass. Thomas's father lowered the rifle, his face slack with disbelief. "They're not attacking." "No," Thomas whispered, watching Running Fox retreat unscathed, the blanket still held high. "They're giving us time to be brave." Inside the cabin, the family huddled, caught between dread and dawning understanding. Outside, 700 Comanche waited not for war, but for something far more terrifying, the chance that a settler boy might step forward, unarmed, to meet their eyes as equals. The wind moaned through the eaves, carrying with it the scent of snow and sage, and the unspoken question, what happens next? The cabin's walls seemed to press inward as the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Thomas's father paced like a caged animal, his boots scuffing against the rough-hewn floorboards, while his mother clutched her apron in white-knuckled fists, her lips moving in silent prayer. The rifle lay abandoned on the table now, its barrel cold, a useless thing when faced with the quiet army outside. Thomas pressed his forehead against the frost-veined window, his breath fogging the glass as he studied the Comanche warriors. They did not fidget, did not speak. They simply waited, their stillness more unsettling than any war cry. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and in that moment, Thomas made his decision. He reached for the door latch, ignoring his father's sharp intake of breath. "Boy, don't you dare," but the words died as Thomas stepped outside, the cold air biting his cheeks. The warriors did not stir, but he felt their eyes on him, heavy as stones. His legs trembled as he walked forward, his boots crunching in the snow, each step measured, deliberate. He kept his hands open at his sides, palms empty, fingers uncurled, a gesture he hoped they would understand. Chief Stormhawk rose from where he sat, his movements fluid, unhurried. Up close, He was even taller than Thomas had imagined, his face lined with the marks of seasons and sorrow. The feathers in his headdress whispered as he turned to regard the boy, his dark eyes unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the chief spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of a man used to being heard. "You gave your blanket to my daughter." It was not a question, but Thomas nodded anyway, his throat too tight for words. The chief's gaze flickered, something shifting behind his eyes before he turned and gestured to Running Fox. The young warrior stepped forward, holding out the folded blanket Thomas had given Little Dove. But now, woven into the fabric were intricate patterns of beads and dyed quills, forming shapes like sunbursts and running horses, things Thomas had no name for but recognized as beautiful. "We return it to you," the chief said, "but changed, as you changed her last moments." Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing the soft wool. The craftsmanship was finer than anything he'd ever seen, each bead sewn with precision. "She didn't make it, did she?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. The chief's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady.
"No."
"But your kindness wrapped her like a song. We do not forget such things." He turned slightly, revealing the gathered warriors behind him, row upon row of solemn faces. "These men rode here to see the boy who showed honor to an enemy. To show you honor in return." A murmur passed through the Comanche, a ripple of motion as one by one, the warriors touched their hands to their hearts, then extended them toward Thomas. It was a gesture he didn't understand, but it filled his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Thomas didn't turn, but he heard his father's uneven footsteps, the hitch in his breath as he took in the scene. The settlers had always spoken of the Comanche as devils, as savages who burned and stole without remorse. Yet here they stood, offering respect to a child for nothing more than an act of mercy. Chief Stormhawk's voice broke the stillness once more. "Your people fear us because we are different, but today you saw us as people. That is a gift greater than any blanket." He inclined his head, then turned and mounted his horse in one smooth motion. The warriors followed, their movements synchronized, as if they shared a single mind. As they rode away, the only sound was the sigh of wind through the grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Thomas stood clutching the beaded blanket, its weight far heavier than it had any right to be. He understood now that this wasn't just fabric, it was a promise, a bridge between two worlds that had spent too long at war. And it was his to carry. The blanket hung on the wall of the cabin now, its intricate beadwork catching the firelight like tiny scattered stars. Thomas traced the patterns with his finger each night before bed, memorizing the swirls and symbols that told a story he couldn't yet read. But where he saw beauty, others saw only a threat. News of the Comanche visit had spread through the settlement like a prairie fire, carried on hushed voices and narrowed eyes. Neighbors who once nodded to Thomas's family now crossed to the other side of the muddy street when they passed. At the trading post, conversations died when Thomas entered, leaving only the creak of floorboards and the weight of unspoken accusations. His father had taken to drinking dark liquid from a tin cup each evening, his gaze fixed on the rifle above the hearth. "You don't know what you've done," he'd mutter, though Thomas wasn't sure if the words were meant for him or the empty room. The settler's fear was a living thing. It curled around doorframes and seeped into the flour sacks, turning every shadow into a Comanche warrior, every snapped twig into an approaching war party. One brittle morning, Thomas found his father in the barn, sharpening an axe with rough, angry strokes. "They're saying we're Comanche lovers at the mill," the man spat, not looking up. "That we invited those savages right to our door." The blades screeched against the whetstone, sending up sparks. Thomas wanted to argue, to say that the warriors had come in peace, that they'd honored him for showing kindness, but the rigid set of his father's shoulders warned against it. Instead, he busied himself with the milking, the rhythmic squirt of warm liquid into the pail filling the heavy silence. Outside, the wind carried the scent of turned earth and distant rain. Spring was coming, though the air still held winter's bite. Thomas stole glances toward the creek where he'd last seen Running Fox, wondering if the Comanche boy still waited there, or if the fragile thread between them had snapped under the weight of grown men's fears. That thread pulled taut again at sundown when Mr. Harker came riding in, his horse lathered and his face flushed with liquor and outrage. "They took my best mare," he bellowed, kicking over a bucket with a clatter. "Your Indian friends left their damn peace blanket and stole my property." Thomas's father was on his feet at once, his earlier doubts drowned by the older man's fury. Thomas opened his mouth. The Comanche who visited wouldn't have done such a thing, not after the honor they'd shown, but Mr. Harker cut him off with a glare. "You stay quiet, boy. This is man's business now." By midnight, the men had gathered 10 settlers with rifles and coiled ropes, their faces hard in the lantern light. Thomas watched from the loft as they mounted up, his stomach twisting. He knew that look. It was the same one the trappers wore when they ran down wolves for bounty. His father paused at the door, his hand on the latch. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Thomas saw something flicker their doubt, maybe, or the ghost of the man who'd once carried him on his shoulders to pick apples. Then the moment passed. The door slammed shut, and the hoofbeats faded into the dark. Alone in the sudden stillness, Thomas climbed down and stood before the Comanche blanket. The beads gleamed faintly, as if holding moonlight within them. He thought of Little Dove's hand clutching the wool, of Running Fox's steady gaze when he returned it. None of this made sense. The warriors had shown more honor in one afternoon than Mr. Harker had in his entire life. A plan formed in his mind, reckless and clear. He'd go to the creek at first light. If Running Fox was there, he'd warn him. If not, well, he'd figure that out when the time came. Thomas touched the blanket one last time, feeling the ridges of beads beneath his fingertips, a language of honor in a world that seemed determined to forget its meaning. Outside, the wind moaned through the eaves, carrying with it the scent of coming rain and something else, something darker. The kind of storm that didn't just wet the earth, but changed it forever. Dawn had not yet broken when Thomas slipped from the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking like a warning beneath his careful steps. The air hung thick with the damp promise of rain, muffling the sound of his movements as he stole past the sleeping livestock and into the silver-gray world beyond the homestead. His father and the other men had not returned from their vengeful ride, leaving the settlement eerily quiet, a hollow shell waiting to be filled with whatever ugliness the day might bring. The creek was a ribbon of black cutting through the mist, its waters swollen with melted snow. Thomas crouched behind a gnarled oak, scanning the opposite bank where the trees grew denser, their shadows pooling like spilled ink. He didn't know if Running Fox would come, didn't even know if the Comanche boy was still alive, but he had to try. A twig snapped upstream. Thomas froze, his pulse hammering in his throat as a figure emerged from the fog. Running Fox stood knee-deep in the shallows, his hands skimming the water's surface as he filled a leather pouch. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the land's every secret, his dark hair tied back with a strip of hide, his shoulders tense beneath a sleeveless tunic. Thomas hesitated, then stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft mud with a squelch that seemed deafening in the stillness. The Comanche boy whirled, a knife flashing into his hand faster than thought. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the water, two boys caught between the hatred of their peoples. Then recognition flickered in Running Fox's eyes, and the knife lowered. "You," he said, the English word rough but clear. His gaze darted past Thomas, searching the trees for others. "Why come alone?" Thomas swallowed. "Men from my settlement, they're riding out. They think your people stole a horse." Running Fox's mouth twisted. "We take no horse." He gestured sharply to the east, where the land rose into rocky hills. "Kiowa raiders passed 2 nights ago. Your people blame us because they do not see tracks, do not listen to Earth's story." He said it with the weary patience of someone who had explained this many times to deaf ears. A crow cawed overhead, the sound like a rusty hinge swinging. Thomas glanced at the sky, where the first pale streaks of morning were bleeding through the clouds. "They won't listen to me," he admitted. "But if you could show them." "Show them?" Running Fox's laugh was sharp as the knife in his hand. "They see Comanche, they shoot. Same as always." He waded closer, the water swirling around his legs. Why you help us? After what your people do? The question hung between them, heavier than the damp air. Thomas thought of the blanket on his wall, of Little Dove's trembling fingers clutching the wool. Because it's right, he said finally, the words sounding small but certain. Running Fox studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. Then we show them together. But not here. He pointed to a distant stand of cottonwoods. Meet when sun is there. He indicated a position halfway to noon. I bring proof. You bring courage. Before Thomas could respond, the Comanche boy melted back into the mist, leaving only ripples behind. The forest seemed to exhale around him, the birds resuming their songs as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Thomas turned toward home, his mind racing. He'd need an excuse to slip away again, maybe tending the far pasture, or checking the trap lines. Lies, but necessary ones. As he trudged up the rise, the first raindrops began to fall, cool against his flushed face. Behind him, the creek murmured secrets to the stones, its voice lost beneath the gathering storm. Somewhere beyond those trees, his father and the others were riding with hate in their hearts and rifles in their hands. And Thomas, caught between two worlds, was the only one who knew the truth. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any burden a boy should bear. But he would bear it anyway, because someone had to. The rain fell in relentless sheets by the time Thomas reached the cottonwoods, his clothes clinging to his skin like a second, heavier self. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the figure waiting beneath the branches. Running Fox, flanked by two older warriors whose faces were carved with the same solemn intensity as Chief Storm Hawk's. They held no weapons, but their posture spoke of readiness, of men prepared for either truth or bloodshed. Running Fox stepped forward, his hand outstretched. In his palm lay a broken arrow fletched with crow feathers, its shaft painted with ochre stripes. Kiowa, he said, thrusting it toward Thomas. Found near stolen horse tracks. The older warrior beside him grunted and made a series of quick gestures, a story told without words, tracing the path of unshod hooves heading northeast, away from Comanche lands. Thomas turned the arrow over in his hands, feeling the rough splinters where it had snapped. His father had taught him enough tracking to recognize the difference between Comanche and Kiowa work, the way the feathers were cut, the pattern of the bindings. This proof might sway reasonable men. But the riders who'd left last night weren't reasonable. They were drunk on fear and Harker's rage. A distant rumble shook the earth, not thunder, but hoofbeats. The warriors tensed, their eyes locking onto the ridge, where a line of mounted settlers emerged through the downpour. Thomas's father rode at the front, his rifle balanced across his saddle, his face a mask of grim determination. Behind him, Harker was already shouting, his voice raw with accusation. There. Told you the boy was consorting with savages. Thomas lunged forward, splashing through the mud to position himself between the two groups, his arms spread wide. They didn't take the horse. He brandished the broken arrow like a torch. It was Kiowa Raiders. Look at the markings. For one fragile moment, the world held its breath. The settlers reined in their horses, their rifles wavering. Thomas's father squinted through the rain, his gaze flickering from the arrow to the warrior's empty hands. Then Harker spat into the mud. Lies. That Injuns put notions in your head, boy. He raised his gun, the barrel swinging toward Running Fox. What happened next unfolded faster than thought. The older Comanche warrior shoving Running Fox aside, the crack of the rifle, the wet thud of a bullet finding flesh. The warrior staggered but didn't fall, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder as he glared at Harker with a look that could have curdled milk. Thomas's father roared, something lost in the wind, grappling with Harker for the weapon. The other settlers milled in confusion, their horses sidestepping in the slick grass. Then the earth itself seemed to move. From every gully and stand of trees, Comanche warriors materialized, not the 700 of before, but enough to encircle the clearing 3 times over. They made no sound, their arrival as silent as owls on the hunt. Chief Storm Hawk rode at their center, his face like storm-carved stone. The settlers' horses reared in panic, One man fell from his saddle with a cry. Thomas stood frozen in the center, rainwater streaming down his face like tears. This was the moment it would all unravel the fragile peace, the tentative trust shattered by a single reckless shot. But then Running Fox was beside him, gripping his wrist in the same way Little Dove had that freezing night. "Now," the Comanche boy hissed. "Speak now." Thomas sucked in a breath and turned to face the settlers, his voice cracking but clear. "They could kill us all right now. But they haven't." He pointed to the wounded warrior, whose blood darkened the rain puddles at his feet. "He took that bullet instead of letting it hit Running Fox. That's not what enemies do." Harker opened his mouth, but Thomas's father silenced him with a look. The man dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the mud as he approached the injured warrior. After a heartbeat's hesitation, he tore a strip from his shirt and offered it as a bandage. The warrior studied him for a long moment, then accepted the cloth with a nod. Chief Storm Hawk watched this exchange, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, each one a stone laid carefully in a bridge. "We will show you the Kiowa Trail. You will see with your eyes what your hearts refuse to know." The rain softened to a drizzle as the two groups stood there, settlers and Comanche, drenched and weary, balanced on the knife's edge between war and something yet unnamed. Thomas looked from his father's rain-streaked face to Running Fox's determined eyes, and for the first time, he understood what courage really meant. It wasn't about standing your ground. It was about stepping forward. The sun broke through the retreating storm clouds like a shy visitor, painting the muddy clearing in gold and amber. No one moved as Chief Storm Hawk dismounted, his beaded moccasins sinking soundlessly into the earth. He walked past Thomas without a glance, stopping instead before the wounded warrior, a man Thomas now recognized as Stone Bear, the tribe's most respected scout. The chief examined the bloodied bandage made from Thomas's father's shirt, then turned to face the settlers with an expression that held neither forgiveness nor anger, but something far more powerful: decision. "Today the river of blood stops here," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of generations. He gestured to the arrow still clutched in Thomas's hand. "The boy speaks truth. But truth is not enough. You must choose to see it." With a sharp motion, he summoned two riders, forward warriors who dropped a bundle at Harker's feet. Unrolled, it revealed a Kiowa saddle blanket, its distinctive diamond pattern still caked with the mud of a hard ride. "Found where your horse was taken. Follow these tracks if you still hunger for revenge. But know this," his gaze swept over each settler in turn, lingering longest on Thomas's father. "We will not stand for false accusations again." The silence that followed was thicker than the storm's aftermath. Harker's mouth worked like a hooked fish, his fingers twitching toward his pistol, but the other settlers had drawn back, their earlier fury dampened by evidence and the unspoken realization that they were outnumbered 3-1. Thomas's father exhaled sharply through his nose, then did something no settler had done. In living memory, he inclined his head to Chief Storm Hawk, just enough to acknowledge the truth without words. As the Comanche turned to leave, Running Fox hesitated, his eyes locking with Thomas's. Between them, past all the things they couldn't say aloud, the shared moments at the creek, the weight of the blanket's promise, the understanding that this fragile piece would need tending like a newborn fire. Then he was gone, vanishing into the trees with the others, leaving only hoofprints filling slowly with rainwater. The ride back to the settlement passed in silence. No one mentioned the way Thomas's father had slowed his horse to match pace with his son, or how Harker lagged behind, muttering under his breath. When they reached the cabin, Thomas's mother rushed out, her face pale with sleepless worry, but the words died on her lips when she saw the Kiowa artifacts and the strange, new light in her husband's eyes. That night, for the first time, the Comanche blanket was brought down from the wall and draped over Thomas's shoulders as the family ate supper, a quiet acknowledgement that some bridges, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Weeks later, when the first wildflowers dotted the prairie, Thomas found a single eagle feather tied with sinew to his fence post. No note accompanied it, but none was needed. Somewhere beyond the creek, A people who had once been enemies now watched over the homestead not as friends, perhaps, but as allies forged in the crucible of shared truth. And as Thomas placed the feather beside the beaded blanket, he understood that honor wasn't a thing you owned, but a chain you carried, link by link, into the future.
The end.
If this story of courage and bridging divides moved you, do consider subscribing for more tales where light triumphs over fear. The next journey awaits. Press that subscribe button so you won't miss when new chapters of humanity unfold. Your support helps keep these timeless lessons alive for generations still learning to walk in wisdom's path.